The pastures and fields of the prime expanse have always been ripe for shepherds and their flocks. Belhaven, a city of 1,000 shining lights, a realm of industry, smog, religion, science, and much noise, is not a place for grazing. Indeed, within the city limits, almost no greenery is to be found, nor does water flow above ground, but only in metal pipes, behemoths the size of Titan's bones, that sound with low, deep, bell-throated tolls as the underground rivers race through them, excited into motion by pumps so gargantuan it boggles the imagination. No, Belhaven has no flocks or herds, and thus the lesser towns in the prime expanse supply all the livestock needs for the nation. Over the centuries it became clear that no one place could corner the market on all of the livestock, for different towns were blessed in various ways to make them suitable for one kind or another. Groxen flourished in the grasses of Bromfield, horses galloped over the gullies of Grimsby, and rams clashed with heavy impacts in the fennels of Meyerfield. For Diridale, the livestock of choice was the Morwen, a slender, hornless herd beast with ghost-pale wool that seemed to cast soft luminosity in just the slightest sliver of moonlight. Morwens are prized by all folk not just for their unique wool, but also for warmth and meat. Still, as any shepherd will tell you adamantly, Morwens are skittish, hard to herd, and deathly afraid of inclement weather. However, even with their faults, no creature of the flock is more loyal and devoted to its shepherd. Ewes will refuse to bear their young if the shepherd is not near, and males, even in heat, will not attack the caretaker who has been diligently at their side day and night, protecting the flock with his life. But now, not one Morwen shepherd of Diridale lives fully at peace, for they remember the tale of one of their own, a widowed man named Doven. His father had shepherded Morwens, and his father before him, and so the knowledge and skill of many generations had come at last into his hands and eyes. Those from the lines that remembered him say that Doven's sight was so keen that he could see a flicker of light in the eyes of a night-maul predator, even in the noonday sun. So skilled were his hands that his touch alone was sufficient to calm and guide his flock. Never did he use his crook roughly or in discipline, but only to rescue a fallen lamb from a crevice or ward off a bold predator with precise strikes that would put out their eyes. And from his great-grandfather, Doven had been gifted with the voice of the spirits, so that his songs carried over the meadows and streams, and he could call his flock together with the melodies he reserved only for them. Under his care and guidance, Doven's Morwen flock grew from 50 to over 300 in the span of a decade. Some he sold for meat, some he kept for shearing, and some he traded with others for clothes and blankets. And yet, some he kept back for himself, for they were as children to him, and he loved them. And even when his wife could not bear him sons or daughters, Doven was satisfied with the Morwen flock's little ones. But his wife was not born to live in the wilds with him. As skilled of a guardian as Doven was for his lambs, his wife was heedless of his warnings, and not as wary of the predators that prowled the field of the expanse at night. To this day, Diridale remembers the sorrow of poor Doven when he carried the body of his beloved in from the field. She was torn and broken, and thus so was Doven. She had not survived his rush from the prairie into town, but had expired in his arms before he'd made it even halfway. A vicious chimera had pounced upon her and begun to feast. Doven had driven the beast off too late, and now he took solace only in the presence of his lambs, for they knew his heart just as he knew theirs. Forever after, his songs to them were mournful, and whenever he sang, their bleating howls would fill the air as they shared in his sorrow. It was some years after Doven's wife was killed that the root of the terror sprang to life. Near the end of the Bronze campaigns, but before the assault on Ran by the Blessed Wardens of Belhaven, came upon the region of the Prime Expanse the most savage and punishing of winters. Snow piled in drifts up to the roofs of the houses, ice formed in what seemed like only moments. The gale-force winds tore at the trees, uprooting them and burying them under thick blankets of white that hid them away from all existence until the much-delayed coming of that year's summer. Travel became almost impossible for ordinary townsfolk, who sheltered in their homes and used up their stores of firewood to keep warm. Outer rooms were unlivable as the cold and ice crept through the windows, slaying those whose positioning of their beds had not shown the proper deference to the power brought to bear by the will of the silence. When the last of the dire wind had abated and the snow had settled many feet deep across the ravaged countryside, the folk of Diridale dug themselves out of their abodes and reconnected. It was many days after that someone thought to look for Doven and his Morwen flock. Some of the more hardy among them made the adventurous trek out to the pasture where he and his herd had last been seen, but predictably they were not found there. Those who had known Doven best and also possessed some of his overflowing knowledge of shepherding knew he must have moved his charges elsewhere to shield them from the brutal storm, but the snow had covered all their tracks. Searches began, and it was once again several days before the tracks of the fleeing Morwen were found to the west, where they presumably would take shelter inland. While this would normally be wise, sensible shepherding, Doven had made a critical error, for it was not yet known that the power which had made the winter savage had come from the farthest reaches of the Wild West, or Doven would surely not have taken his flock there. When those who had caught sight of the tracks followed, they noticed the ordered dimensions of the proceedings, for the flock marched in perfect lines together, 2 by 2. Not the disorganized, large group that several hundred Morwens would surely have been, for in going 2 by 2, there was no shelter from the wind in the interior of the flock, as herds are wont to do, keeping warm at the center while changing places with those who are near to freezing on the edges, and thus all the members of the flock may travel even in bitter cold to reach a new destination. Yet no bodies lined the way, and so all the Morwens must have made it along the path. Yet, just as absent as any bodies, were the tracks of Doven. It was as though he had not accompanied them on foot at all, but either been borne on the backs of the Morwens or remained absent altogether. This feature greatly puzzled the trackers, who knew that Doven would never have allowed his flock to leave the pasture without his headship, nor let them bear him as though he were a burden. Yet, stranger still the mystery became when the straight line of trail continued into the west for miles upon miles. Astonishing was the immensity of the snow and ice that had suffocated the land, yet less astonishing than the fact that the Morwen flock had apparently not let up in its trek. So far, in fact, did the trail go that the trackers followed it all the way to Bromfield, past the Groxen herds, and beyond. With great apprehension, the trackers continued to follow the trail until suddenly the Morwen tracks ceased, right at the edge of Fideb Forest, that loathsome place of ever-darkness, mire, and haunting. What's more, the trail did not spread out into a gathering of prints, nor did it continue on into the trees. It simply stopped, as though the Morwens had stepped off the ground 2 by 2 and into the sky, never to be seen again. It was here that the trackers found the first signs of Doven. 2 prints in the snow at the head of the trail, one from each unclad foot, unmoving, pointing at the forest, and lying beside them in the snow, his shepherd's crook. Questions and rumors spread among the town, but no one who claimed to have seen him had more than his own witness as evidence. That is, until one shepherd boy from near Bromfield and his father heard of the missing man and came all the way to Diridale to tell of their sighting. They told of a long line of hundreds of Morwens, led by a man hooded, gripping a shepherd's crook, and making a long, wailing noise of deepest grief. Behind him, his lines of livestock all walked with heads also bowed, and when the man wailed, the Morwens echoed his call down the line, the noise resounding as if off the walls of some great dark cave where no joy is known. The boy and his father did not see Doven and the Morwens reach Fideb Forest, and so the trail remained as cold as the fields of the prime expanse. But it was not the end for Doven of Diridale, for at the first thaw of spring some months later, a man staggered into town from the west, clinging to a shepherd's crook, old and haggard and miserable beyond all relief. Against all odds, Doven had found a way to make it back through the wilds, evading the night mauls, grave shocks, chimeras, and all other manner of natural foe. When it became known that Doven had returned to the local saloon, the town gathered to hear him speak. Those who caught sight of him were both amazed and disturbed. Doven's face was not scarred or monstrous, and it did not show any signs of the bites of insects or irritations from the plants of the wilds. Instead, it was the deepest, most abiding sadness anyone had ever seen. As he never seemed to blink, the sorrow and despair poured from his eyes, giving the surrounders clear view through the windows to his soul. Only one glimpse of his face would cause women to shed tears, children to wail for their mother's embraces, and men to groan with a weariness that could not possibly have come from this world. Yet Doven told naught of his journey. For hours the town elders questioned him, begged for explanation, but the shepherd either would not or could not speak. At the end of the night, when the curious town had left the saloon and returned to their homes with no hope of having their morbid fascination satisfied, Doven remained in the saloon by the grace of the childless barkeep Hamo Sourbinder and his wife Bethia, who offered him a room above the establishment. Doven graciously accepted their offering and retired to his chamber, and the Sourbinders heard filtering through the walls of their abode a song, for Doven had lost all manner of speech, but the music of his sorrow remained with him. Only now, with not only his wife but also his flock gone, Doven's sad music came from deep within, from a place that cast the notes as if they were daggers. The sounds pierced their souls like a spear, tore at them like a night maw's teeth, and weighed them down like a millstone. All night long he sang, and the Sourbinders soon found themselves sitting outside his door, weeping uncontrollably, until their exhaustion overcame them and they fell asleep against the wall, holding one another for comfort even though their company only deepened the bottomless pit inside them. By morning, when Doven emerged, Hamo and Bethia met him with eyes suffused with tears. The despair of the shepherd had become theirs. The damage done to Doven passed on to them. They no longer remembered their life before hearing him, and they begged for relief. Doven looked upon them with great pity, knowing he must remedy the agony he had caused. Without a smile, and still without blinking, Doven began to care for the Sourbinders throughout the day. As patrons came to the saloon, Doven's songs set their own souls ablaze with despair and sorrow, and thus he came to care for each and every man, woman, and child who entered the establishment. And there, among those he cared for, Doven found his voice again. Now, though, it was not the light, satisfied tenor, but low, calm, and slow, once more like an echo in a cavern. The Sourbinders served food and drink to all who came to them that day, and soon so generous had they become that their stores had run dry, and their supplies had been all used up. Yet still, as all gathered around Doven, not a one complained or uttered a foul word against anyone else. By next morning, Doven had sung, the gathering had wept until their bodies ached, and then he had tended to them, calming them, teaching them, feeding them, and asking for nothing in return. Never had those in Diridale felt so fulfilled, so complete, for the range and breadth of their emotions and understanding had broadened significantly. However, there was one group in Diridale that would go nowhere near this town's new curiosity. The other Morwen shepherds would hear nothing of this man, for they believed he was cursed. Some said, and their descendants still say to this day, that it was not really Doven at all, but something else. Something that had stolen his form and pulled all who listened to him into a strong delusion. But it mattered not, for the shepherd of Diridale had returned and brought a great awakening with him. Over the next few days, more and more people came to the Sourbinders' saloon to hear Doven's songs, weep with him, and be reawakened to their fulfillment. Once they were broken down into abject misery and sorrow, Doven picked them back up, taught them to feed one another, clothe one another, bring one another drinks from the flowing river, and live together in harmony. With many teachings, prayers, and offerings of his songs, Doven taught those who came to him to live and move and have their being as a common body, each member of the group caring for one another. Within a week, the Sourbinders' saloon grew insufficient for these gatherings, and Doven came to the local Fagar priest, a kindly old man named Father Emmerich Thunderbrow. The two men met inside the parish for many long hours, during which Doven asked to be allowed use of the holy sanctuary of the church for his flock to meet during the week. Father Emmerich, ever the tolerant and kind sort, listened patiently to Doven, but his spirit was moved deep within him, and he could not bring himself to permit such a thing to be done in the holy church of the Fagar. When Doven heard this, a darkness crept into his forlorn, unblinking eyes, and he began to sing. Then Father Emmerich was filled with a sudden rage, and he shouted back all the chants he had learned from his youth, those sanctified sayings that had been passed down from generation to generation, spoken into being at the beginning, it is said, by the Creator, lost to us now, but plentiful and powerful in the mind and heart of Father Emmerich Thunderbrow. Doven's throat was shut up, and he was driven from the parish. He returned to his flock once more unspeaking, only singing, and his people were driven now not to despair, but to pernicious rage. They swarmed into the streets and made toward the parish, and it was only by chance that the passing wardens of Belhaven were returning along the route to the city and stopped in to have a drink at the saloon. When they saw the mob descend upon the church and Father Emmerich, they stood between the vengeful hatred of the people and the holy Fagar Father who had denied their shepherd his desire. The whole town was awoken to knowledge of the clamor, and soon all members were up and had taken up arms, for Father Emmerich was well loved by all. Indeed, he had been well thought of by everyone in town, including by those who now sought to lynch him and steal his parish, and so their neighbors stood guard with confusion and great fear, not knowing if the same unknown fate should befall them. In a short time, words had been flung about, and violence seemed imminent, stopped only by the arrival of the shepherd, who came to still the anger of his new flock. Doven reappeared with his shepherd's crook, and with a gentle guiding hand, led all his followers away from the parish, away from Father Emmerich, away from violence, and away from Diridale. They settled on the outskirts of the town, coming to rest in the same field where Doven's Morwen flock had once grazed. There they began to build. It was not the building of industrious people who settle a land, fell trees, till the soil in great tracts, and civilize the wild and savage territory. It was the building of basic shelters, small fires, and scraping together whatever they had brought with them, weapons, some slight tools, and clothing used as blankets in the chilly spring nights. Thus, Doven's flock made its home in the field. For some months, they lived on the outskirts, and their shelters gradually grew into crude huts that came together, forming a loose network of partially roofed gathering places. Those who espied them from afar described them as living in a great livestock pen. None in the town could get too close, or they were attacked by the flock, run off with weapons, screamed at as if by wild men who had only ever lived apart from society. Curiously, only other shepherds were permitted to come near, bringing their flocks with them. Doven reacted with limitless joy when other Morwen flocks visited, and his people treated the Morwens as if they were family. Visiting shepherds tended not to return, however, for a deep, uneasy feeling came over them while they remained. They claimed that the people living there were as happy as ever, happier, in fact, than any they had ever seen. Yet it was more than it should have been. They smiled too long when told of something, laughed too loudly when they should have been soft, or too softly when they should have been boisterous. And underneath it all, they would watch the Morwens as if both adoring and fascinated by them. And they did so with the contentedness of a people who knew a great secret that no one else in all the world could possibly understand. All the while at work or sitting alone in the shade, they hummed the wordless songs taught to them by their shepherd, who had once sung those same tunes over his own Morwen flock. It was not long before the thefts began, and Doven's flock was easy to blame, though no one could prove it. At first, it was only some small things: a cooking pot or pan drying on a windowsill, a freshly washed blanket hanging on the line, a shovel left unattended in an unfinished hole. All in Diridale agreed it was Doven's people, but none dared go near the pen, nor did the small thefts warrant in their minds the necessity of forming a posse and rounding up the criminals. It was only some small things. Only small things. But then the things missing became more and more inexplicable. A farmer plowing his field turned to find that his Groxa had vanished, seemingly without a sound, tracks leading in one direction and suddenly vanishing. A loaf of bread disappeared from inside a locked cabinet in an interior pantry. Horses led into the barn for the night were gone by morning, with no tampering at the door or the lock. People became anxious, and rumors of dark, evil magic abounded until the whole town was permeated by a tense, anxious fear. Children awoke screaming in the dead of night, telling of a hideous figure in their nightmares that pinned them to their beds and brandished shearing blades that were meant not for their hair, but for their very souls. It was then that Father Emmerich could bear it no longer. He gathered the town elders into his parish one afternoon and told them of how Doven had come to him, asking to use the sanctuary over which he'd been appointed as God's under-shepherd, explaining very calmly his vile heresy, his intention to replace Father Emmerich as the true guide of Diridale's vulnerable, lost, and needy souls. "You tend to your flock, but never shear them," Doven had told Emmerich. "They must be sheared, Father. They must be sheared." Emmerich was convinced that the other shepherds were right, that Doven was not himself, but in fact an unholy abomination that meant to become a false god in the eyes of all who would follow him. The town elders agreed, and that very day they summoned the remaining men of the town and began to plan. But as urgently as Emmerich's voice was, his cries to them could not shake the fear rooted deep inside. The very name of Doven struck a chord within them, and they would not proceed without extravagant caution. The plan of the elders was thrown into confusion as fearful men disagreed on the minutiae, for always will the cowardly, faithless, and detestable man search out a means by which action might not be taken, and thus he might retire early to the safety of his indolent bed, even whilst his house catches fire and burns down around him from his fear to combat the flames. Indeed, in spite of Emmerich's warnings, the town of Diridale stole away to bed that night, with their covers tucked over their chins, eyes wide and alert, ears catching every rustle of the leaves or passing of the wind through the cracks of their homes, the creaking of the wood under the stresses of time and weather. Through their windows that night drifted an ominous sound. The commune sang, lifting their voices as one, the songs of their false shepherd. The sounds drifted over the prairies and into the homes of the townsfolk, who shut their ears, stuffed them with fur or wax, held pillows over their heads, anything to keep the noise out. But as soon as it had begun, the song was ended, though no man dared to leave his bed, and no woman dared to peer out the window. Lamps remained lit as long as the angst of their bearers could keep them burning, but one by one, eyelids drooped heavy, breathing deepened, and the town of Diridale slept soundly for hours. By morning, the horror was revealed, for every child in Diridale under the age of 11 had vanished. Immediately the enraged town took up their arms and descended upon the pen of Doven's flock, only to find that they were too late. The pen was empty. The shelters had been torn down in a mad exodus, all the fires had been stamped out, whether by intention or in the stampede it was not clear. The hair on the backs of the townspeople bristled with terror when they discovered that every scrap of wood, paper, or anything that could be written upon or carved into bore the same message for all who would find this abandoned place. The flock must be sheared. The search began in earnest, and the tracks were found quickly. They had gone side by side, 2 by 2, westward. Those with a good memory panicked and raced toward Fideb Forest, toward the place where they had found the shepherd's crook and the footprints in the snow earlier that year, out past Bromfield. The townsfolk of Bromfield had already gathered at the spot, having seen the march and alerted their town guard. Armed with weapons and desperate wills, the townsfolk from the 2 locales plunged headlong into the accursed forest, heedless of all dangers save that which had taken their kin. Though they must have known there would be no pleasant reunion in the darkness, what they discovered was even more abominable than they had feared. Deep in the foliage stood a tree with no leaves and branches as sharp as the blades of swords. It was on these innumerable branches that they found the townsfolk, including the children. Their bodies were carved and segmented as though with huge blades, eyes sunken in as though starved, and the stench of foul magic hung in the fetid air. When the wardens finally made it to the scene several days later, they and their attending Fagar priests confirmed the worst. The bodies had been hollowed out, souls torn away, leaving this ghastly scene behind. The flock had been sheared. As for the shepherd, he was found at the base of the tree. At first it seemed he sat on his knees, his hands gripping his shepherd's crook. The stench of magic was at its worst around him. When a warden made it through the miasma and swung his blade to take the shepherd's head, it passed through very little. Only a paper-thin waif of Doven's outer layer remained, and his hollow form fell to pieces on the floor of the forest. The crook was determined to have been an enchanted instrument, and the wardens took possession of it, handing it over to the Fagar of the High Sanctum in Belhaven for safekeeping. As for the townsfolk of Diridale, they left the forest with only the memory of that awful, gruesome scene, the remains of their kinsfolk strung up on the tree. They could not remove them without much toil in the dark, evil forest, and Father Emmerich would not hear of the remains being buried on the ground of his sacred church, nor within the limits of the town he had sworn to defend from all manner of falsehood and evil. Thus, in the end, the only thing the folk of Diridale carried back to their empty town was the same deep, abiding, bottomless pit of sorrow that had once been so keenly felt and so abundantly shared by their infamous false guide. Since that day, the people of Diridale are far more private and far less trusting. They have learned the lessons of Doven, that the hollow places within a man are never empty for long. Not every shepherd leads his flock toward the light, and the things that call to us in our loneliness are not always there to save us. For when sorrow sings too long in the dark will start to sing back. Thanks for listening to one of my horror fantasy folktales, dark little legends from the world of my next novel, The Decay. These stories come from the land of Zarathis, a place of old magic, buried terrors, broken truths, and places where reality has worn thin enough for nightmares to press their fingers through. Some tales are warnings, some are fragments of history, and some are lies that have survived long enough to grow teeth of their own. As The Decay draws closer, these folk tales offer glimpses into the world behind the novel, fears, myths, and the shadows its people have learned not to name. Once again, thanks for listening, and tread carefully. In Zarathis, very few voices can be trusted.